Joining me now from Beijing is Chinese international relations expert Victor Ga, and with me here in the studio is Brian Becker. He's the author of Imperialism in the 21st Century, and he's also executive director of the Answer Coalition. Welcome to both of you to the show. Brian, let me start with you. Fidel Castro had been out of office for several years when he died, but he still exerted enormous influence in the country, even after he handed power to his brother, Raul Castro. He's dead now. It's the end of an era. What does it mean for Cuba?
Well, I think Cuba's had the benefit of the fact that there was a 10-year period in which Fidel retired as the head of state. In historic revolutionary leaders, when there's a sudden departure of that leader, whether it was Lenin in Russia after the Russian Revolution or Mao Zedong in China, usually there's a period of turbulence and factional struggle. This decade of smooth transition has allowed the Cubans to carefully plan the transition. There is the continuity of the historic generation, as Hugo mentioned, and Raul is there, and other leaders from the Cuban Revolution. But there's a new tier, a new generation of Cuban revolutionary leaders. They were not participants in the 1959 revolution, but they are very devoted to the cause of the Cuban Revolution, to the cause of Latin American unity, to the cause of socialism. They are there. They are ready to take over. This will be Raul Castro's last term in office, and he's made it clear that when he leaves, the next generation comes, and there, in fact, will be term limits. So there will be change, but I think overall the dominant mood will be continuity. And you can see on the part of the Cuban people, millions are coming out. You can't force people to come and show grief. That shows that the caricature of Cuba by Donald Trump or the American political elites or the mainstream media, that it's just a tyranny, a terrible nightmare, that's not how the Cuban people feel. They see the benefits of their revolution.
Getting back to what you said about the old guard and Fidel Castro, the people who were with him during the revolution, the times when he was in power, will they be seeing him very differently from the new generation?
Well, I think the people who fought in the Revolutionary War cannot be identified in the same way with any other generation. They were there putting their lives on the line with no guarantee of success. And then against all odds, they recreated and reorganized Cuban society. The people who are coming now are there because of their technological prowess, their intelligence, their training. They haven't been tested in the same way in terms of combat. Combat makes a big difference in terms of the leadership, the organic leadership of a country that emerges from colonialism. We saw that even in the American Revolution. We see that in all revolutions. But I think what the Cubans have done, because the party has maintained a stability and has had this period of transition, I think it will be something where the next generation is ready to take over and will take over in the same spirit as the last generation.
Right, let's bring in Hugo Cancio. He is a Cuban-American entrepreneur. He was born in Cuba. He does business with Cuba. Hugo, welcome to the show. Cubans are now saying goodbye to their longtime leader. What are you hearing? What are they saying to you? How are they remembering him?
Look, people are very calm and very respectful. People are just mourning the death of one of the most influential and controversial leader of this century. Their leader, the man which two generations were born under his umbrella, under his government, under his guidance. So the people are, extremely respectful, mourning his death. And some people are actually feeling it, are hurt, the death of Fidel Castro.
Victor, when Castro's death was announced, the Chinese president Xi Jinping remembered him, and I'm quoting here, as a great person of our era who'd made immortal historical achievements for the development of world socialism. What was the relationship like between Castro and the Chinese leadership through the years that he ran Cuba?
The passing away of Fidel Castro is not only a passing away of a person and a leader, but truly a passing away of a historical era. Between China and Cuba, in more recent decades, there has been great friendship and goodwill and high level of cooperation. On the other hand, in the late 1960s and throughout 1970s, there were bumps in China-Cuban relations, mainly because at that time, China and the former Soviet Union were against each other. There was a split of ideology between Moscow and Beijing, and Fidel Castro chose to side by the former Soviet Union. And that caused freezing of relations between China and Cuba. Fortunately, after China started to embark on reform and opening to the outside world, especially since the 1990s and after Fidel Castro's historic visit to China in the early 1990s, relations bounced back between China and Cuba. And now we all mourn the passing away of Fidel Castro, and we truly believe Fidel Castro was not only a legendary leader, but he was a household name here in China. Most of us actually grew up by thinking of Castro as a truly international leader, not only a leader of Cuba, and he has demonstrated his courage and vision and wisdom by standing firmly up against the United States, proving that the U.S. will and all the sanctions levied against Cuba eventually failed. And in that sense, I think the proclamation of independence of Cuba, but also standing firm on its own ground, proved that Fidel Castro will always be remembered as an exceptional and outstanding and courageous leader in the Latin American countries, but also throughout the world, especially in the emerging developing countries.
Hugo Cancio, take us back to the time when Fidel Castro launched this revolution that changed Cuba, changed the world in many respects. He came from a relatively privileged background. So what was it that drove him to launch this revolution? Where did the revolutionary zeal, the fire, come from?
Well, listen, at the time, in the 1950s, there was racism and segregation, social injustices going on in this country. The Cuban economy was in the hands of American business and American interests. There was a lot of discontent among the Cuban, among all Cubans. The Batista government, the Batista regime was a dictatorship. So, all this student movement, Fidel Castro came out as one of their leaders and decided to change the course of history, decided to confront a government that was a dictatorship, that was abusing its people, and his ideas were ideas the majority of the Cuban people approved and supported. Evidence of that is when he marched into Havana in January 1st, 1959, the majority of the Cuban people, including some of the people that are living in exile, were part of his, were supporters of his movement, of his revolutionary movement. So he transformed the history of Cuba, and in essence, the history of all revolutionary movement around Latin America and in many countries around the world. Back in those days, there were a lot of injustices, and there were American imperialism, as they call it here, dominating the world, and especially in Central and South America. So Fidel became an icon. Fidel became a world figure. Fidel changed the course of Cuban history forever.
Brian, if we fast forward to the last year, President Obama here in the United States took steps to normalize relations with Cuba, restore diplomatic relations, and that is still going on today. How was that seen by Fidel Castro?
Well, Fidel was, as you could see in his comment after President Obama was able to speak to the Cuban people, he was making it clear that the Cuban people, while wanting normalized relations with the United States, were not going to be dictated to by President Obama or anyone else. He made it very crystal clear that the Cuban people were not going to take crumbs from someone else's table. We have to remember, Cuba has done so much. 10% of its national budget is devoted to education. It has a literacy that's compared to 2% of America's national budget. The Cubans have 99% literacy. The Cubans have universal health care. They've done so much to take doctors around the world. Cuba has an outsized role in world politics, so Cuba's not going to be on its knees in front of anyone. President Obama recognized that the blockade and the hostility towards Cuba had not isolated Cuba, it had isolated the United States in Latin America. And so he said the old policy doesn't work, so after 54 years, let's reopen embassies in Havana and Washington. But right now you have President-elect Donald Trump coming in. You see his rhetoric, his maligning rhetoric after Fidel's death. He said, the terrible, brutal dictator has died. Firing squads, a life of tyranny and poverty, the deprivation of human rights. I mean, this is the talk of the Cold War. So the Cubans, even though they know that there could be the possibility of good neighborly relations with the United States, they also know that those policies could be undone, as they may be being undone by the new president-elect. So Cuba is going to ultimately be self-reliant and independent, and not hoping to be on the American gravy train. So I think the Cuban pride, the Cuban strength, its resilience will make a big difference right now.
Victor, Fidel Castro and Cuba had a huge impact on the developing world. Cuba under Castro played a key role in the post-colonial wars in southern Africa, against apartheid in South Africa, the fight for independence in Angola, as Professor Al-Zughri mentioned in the first part of the program. What's your assessment of the impact he had in the developing world?
First of all, Cuba, under the leadership of Fidel Castro, exercised a disproportionately larger impact on global affairs than the size of its economy or the size of its population would have allowed Cubans to exercise. And in that sense, I think it's largely due to the outstanding leadership of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was truly an inspiration, and not only to the Cuban people, but also to many, many people throughout the world. In China, for example, I, among many others, grew up by learning about Fidel Castro, understanding him as a leader, and reading about all the legendary stories about him and the Cuban Revolution. And we really got very inspired by such an outstanding leader and great leader, especially when we thought about Cuba being so close to the United States, and the United States throughout these decades has been menacing against Cuba. And I think you just now mentioned that under President Obama, the relations between Cuba and the United States were starting to normalize. And it's, I think, a recognition of the victory of the Cuban people and the Cuban government, rather than it was the work of any sanctions imposed by the United States. And this, again, demonstrated in a very explicit manner that the world is diversified. There is not just one version of the truth. And the United States cannot bully other countries, especially its immediate neighbor, Cuba. And I think this really is very inspiring to people throughout the world, in many countries.
Hugo, I've just got 30 seconds left. What about the impact Fidel Castro had in Latin America?
Look, it's a huge impact. We were witness of the treaty between the Colombian government and the guerrilla. Fidel Castro has his hands all over it. It was under his guidance. I mean, the impact is huge. He spread, his revolutionary movement on justice, movement to abolish some justice, to promote free education, free healthcare. I mean, Fidel Castro. It's a Latin American icon. It's a world icon. He dominated the headlines for over a decade, half a decade.
Hugo Cancio, Brian Becker, Victor Gar, thanks to all of you for joining us.